beginning, there was chaos, and the god Marduk moved over the waters. And the waters were a dragon named Tiamat. Marduk kicked Tiamat's butt and cut her in half. And then Marduk used one half of Tiamat's body to make the waters below, and the other half Marduk put up in the sky to make the waters above. In between them, Marduk put a dome called the firmament to keep them apart. Later on, Marduk made some dry land and then some lights for the heavens. And then he started hearing the gods complaining about how much work it was to grow food, so he took some of their blood and a little bit of dirt, and he made people. Now the people could do all the work. Proud of his accomplishments, Marduk sat back, relaxed, and celebrated his rule as king over all the gods. The Babylonian creation narrative, called the Enuma Elish, bears a striking resemblance to the first creation story in the book of Genesis. Both stories begin in primordial chaos. In both cases, light then arrives. Then the god divides the water and creates the firmament. After that, dry land and the lights for the heavens. Marduk skips the part about making the animals, but both stories do have the final creative act being the making of human beings. And then both stories end with the gods resting. To be sure, there are differences between these stories as well, but this is far too much similarity to dismiss as a simple accident. Given the fact that the Babylonian Empire was much more powerful than ancient Israel, and that the Enuma Elish was probably composed earlier than Genesis, most likely it's the story that's in our Bible, which is the derivative work. So the question we should ask ourselves is, why would the writers of Genesis borrow so much from their enemies, the Babylonians? A blonde teenager is walking down a darkened city street, alone at night. She hears a noise in a nearby alleyway. She pauses. "Hello?" she says. Someone could be hurt, but there's no reply. She turns and begins to head down the alleyway, searching for any sign of someone on the ground. Finding nothing, she turns around to head out of the alleyway, but someone jumps out from behind her. They have a snarling, monstrous face, gleaming white, inhuman fangs in the darkness. She smiles, pulls a wooden stake out from her purse. She's not the prey after all. She's the slayer. This is the scenario that inspired Joss Whedon to create both the movie and the television show, Buffy the Vampire Slayer. He'd seen enough horror movies where blonde women were victimized by monsters. He thought it would be interesting to flip the script. What if the blonde girl wasn't the victim? What if she was able to defend herself? To quote Buffy Summers herself, "I'm that thing that monsters have nightmares about." What Buffy the Vampire Slayer was doing is called subverting the genre. Works of art don't exist independently of each other. They all borrow from the same conventions that they use to help tell stories. A cluster of these conventions is called a genre. For example, in the horror genre, it's conventional for young, attractive people, especially women, to be portrayed as victims. It's conventional for these victims to make terrible choices, like walking alone into a darkened alley at night. And then it's conventional for a monster to jump out at just the right time to scare the audience and to make a bloody mess out of the victim. Buffy the Vampire Slayer follows some of these conventions very closely, telling us what genre it belongs in and setting up certain expectations. Therefore, when it subverts the paradigm and Buffy kills the vampire, it has the power to surprise and tell a new type of story. Just like every other literary work through history, the Bible was not written in isolation. It references other works of literature that were around at the time that it was written. Different parts of it belong to different genres, and it follows literary conventions of its time. So if we wanted to get a better understanding of Paul's epistles, for example, it would be worth our time to read other letters from the period. Scholars might also choose to study Greek and Roman philosophy or first century Judaism to try and understand what Paul might be meaning. Or if we wanted to get a better grasp on the Gospels, it would be worth our time to read other biographies and histories, such as the work of the first century Jewish historian Josephus. It should be no surprise, therefore, that in order to understand the creation myths of the Hebrew Bible, it is helpful to look at the creation myths of other cultures which ancient Israel interacted with. Particularly, the Babylonian text called the Enuma Elish reveals a lot about the meaning of the myths in Genesis. Not only are these two texts part of the same genre, but the Genesis text seems to borrow a lot of the conventions from the Enuma Elish. As I pointed out at the beginning, the creation sequence is exactly the same. These two stories also share a lot of basic cosmological assumptions. They both believe that the earth is dry land raised up out of primordial waters. They also both hold that there is a dome which holds the waters above at bay. So when gods get angry, all they have to do is open the floodgates to let the waters in to destroy everything below. Knowing this, you won't be surprised that the Babylonians also have a worldwide flood myth like the Noah story. The two cultures shared so many assumptions about the way that the world works. One of those assumptions was theological. The ancient religion of Israel wasn't fully monotheistic. In the Ten Commandments, you'll notice that the first commandment is that you shall have no other gods before me, which, like many other places in the Hebrew Bible, accepts the existence of other gods. Just Israel wasn't allowed to worship them. The basic belief of ancient Israel, which was common to many peoples at the time, was that the gods were basically tribal patrons. The God of Israel was the God of Abraham and Isaac, the God which had selected their people out of all the peoples to protect and to sponsor. The Babylonians had their own god to protect them, Marduk, and the Canaanites had theirs, Baal. Philosophers call this type of belief Henotheism. It's basically the my God can beat up your God of religious philosophies. The writers of the Hebrew Bible viewed Marduk as a competitor to the God of Israel. Therefore, when they copied from the Enuma Elish, they weren't doing it to flatter Babylon. It was an act of one-upmanship. They were basically saying, anything that Marduk can do, the Lord can do better. Remnants of this henotheistic perspective can be spotted throughout the Bible. It's why in Psalm 74, for example, it says that by your might you divided the waters, you smashed the heads of the dragons in the waters. This is a reference to that battle between Marduk and Tiamat in the Babylonian creation story of the Enuma Elish. Only here it is the Lord of Israel that is doing the slaying of the dragon and the dividing of the waters. And it's the memory of that battle, which is why in Psalm 77 it says, when the waters saw you, O God, when the waters saw you, they were afraid. The very deeps trembled. The battle between the Lord of Israel and the dragon is referenced twice in Isaiah, and the entire 41st chapter of Job is dedicated to it. All of these are echoes of that ancient competition between Israel and Marduk. But these competitions weren't limited to just the God of Israel and Marduk. They included all the gods in the region. So, for example, the Canaanite god Baal was a god of storms, normally depicted in rain and thunder and lightning. During the story of the prophet Elijah, the God of Israel has created a drought through the whole region to demonstrate that he is more powerful than the Canaanite god, able to control the weather better than Baal can. And when Elijah finally confronts the prophets of Baal, it's for this reason that the power of the God of Israel is demonstrated in a lightning strike. And these competitions didn't remain only in the Hebrew Bible, they spread to the New Testament also. When Jesus is on the Sea of Galilee with his disciples and he orders the wind and the waves to be calm, it is because he is demonstrating who is really master here. He is proving that it is he and not the Canaanite gods that is in control. The writers of the book of Genesis borrowed from the Enuma Elish, but not as a form of flattery. They did it to prove that the God of Israel was superior to Marduk, the god of Babylon. Did Marduk divide the waters with a sword? Well, the God of Israel did it with just his words. Did Marduk put the firmament in the sky? Nope, the God of Israel did it. Like Joss Whedon did with Buffy the Vampire Slayer, they followed the conventions of the Enuma Elish up to a point, but then they subverted the entire genre with one dramatic change near the end. When Marduk creates humanity, it's almost an afterthought in the story, and humanity is said to be created as his slaves. But in Genesis, when God creates humanity, it's the climax of the whole narrative, and humanity is created in God's own image, granted near divine dignity. The Babylonian story is imperialist. All people are created to be enslaved to Marduk, but the Genesis story is liberative. People are granted incredible privilege and freedom. The Enuma Elish ends with Marduk and the gods enjoying their rest, because humanity is now doing all their work for them. By contrast, the first creation narrative in Genesis ends with God inviting humankind to enter into the Sabbath rest with him. And that makes all the difference. Lots of stories begin with in the beginning. It's how they end that determines their meaning. And it's these contrasts and comparisons that make the Bible such a strange book of books.